Well, and a very pleasant day to you today. I trust you're all doing well. I'd like to get started as rapidly as we can today, but I do pray that you are doing well and that the Lord is blessing you in everything you do. We can't wait to see you again, and as the Lord brings us back together, what a day of rejoicing that will be. But in that mindset, we'll just keep going with the lessons in the video and trust that they are meaningful to you. Today we're going to go through the Song of Solomon as rapidly as we can. A lot of ground to cover even in one session. I must confess to you that this is one of my favorite books. A number of years ago, I took a Bible study group that I was leading. We took 2 years to go through the Song of Solomon. We went through verse by verse. There are 117 verses in the Song of Songs, and sometimes we take 2 to 3 hours every Wednesday night, and we would go through the Song of Songs. 2 years it took us to complete the study, but what a blessing it was to us. I was truly moved as the Lord would open up to our minds and hearts some of the great wisdom in the Song of Solomon. And so there's no way I can do that justice tonight, but I want to at least give an overview, give some meaning to the book, probably beyond what you've seen in the past. But let's get started immediately because we do have a lot of ground to cover. So let's close out that and get into our PowerPoint. And we're going to go through, as we have over the course of this series of studies, starting with looking at the Hebrew word for the book in the ancient Hebrew Bible. So here we're taking a couple of words out of the first verse of this Song of Solomon in the text. So verse 1 of chapter 1 of the Song of Solomon starts out this way: the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And so that is the very first few words of this book, and that is taken by the Hebrews to mean the title of the book. Obviously, they're taking Solomon's word for it, that this is how he titled it, the Song of Songs. So that's the way it was classified in their Bible. Now, I'd like to take that phrase that he uses there, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, and give you a little bit different look at it when we come to the conclusion of this particular study. So hang on to that thought, and we'll come back to it. So first of all, let's look at this as the fifth book of the poetry genre, or sometimes it's referred to as the wisdom literature genre, that separates this category in the Old Testament. So we've gone through the books of the law, the Torah, we've looked at the history section, and now we're going through the poetry section, and this is the conclusion to this particular genre. Next week we will get into the books of the prophets, starting with Isaiah. The next thing I'd like to point out to you is that there are other titles for this book. Sometimes in some English translations, it will be referred to by that old Hebrew phraseology, the Song of Songs, or sometimes it's referred to as the Canticles. And Canticles is just an ancient English word for to sing. And so here's another way of phrasing this particular book. But consider the way the ancient Hebrew language uses terms like this, that talks about the King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords in reference to Jesus. And so this phraseology, this way of phrasing, King of Kings means that, okay, of all the kings, there's one king that rises above them all. And this King of Kings, that's Jesus. He is also the Lord of Lords. So even lords bow the knee to him as their Lord. So this phraseology, this frame of words actually carries with it a great emphasis and shows that the object of this phrase is the highest of all the category that it finds itself in. So another way we see it used in the Old Testament is the Holy of Holies. The highest place of holiness in all of Israel is in the very center of the tabernacle or the temple of Solomon. And now Solomon uses this phraseology when he writes this particular song, and he calls this the Song of Songs. It is the song above every song. There is no greater song than this one. And you've got to understand that songs are written in very special ways. They're written with special words to carry special meaning. They're written to rhyme perfectly. They're written to keep great rhythms. And songs are written to convey the deepest desires and the greatest thoughts of the human mind. And so, of course, Solomon, the wisest man of all, is going to write a song that's going to convey such great wisdom. And he uses specific and particular language, and he phrases it in such a way that he can say that this is of all songs the greatest of songs. Now, what's fascinating is Solomon wrote 1,005 psalms. That's quite prolific. This is told us in the book of 1 Kings that he wrote that many songs, and yet he says this one is the song above all songs. So let's go on. The next thing we need to look at is that the authorship is truly Solomon's. And of course, we could easily go to the Song of Songs, verse 1, chapter 1, and it says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So he's claiming, he's actually demonstrating he is the author of this great piece of music. So he's the author, and I don't think there's any doubt, I don't think there's any controversy over the fact that Solomon wrote the Song of Songs. Now think of it from this perspective. I think this helps us as we analyze it. He's the wisest man of all. So if he's written 1,005 songs, he's very accomplished. He knows how to write a song. He knows how to write poetry. He knows how to convey great meaning in a few words. And so here we see that the wisest man of all is writing his magnum opus, which is a Latin phrase which means his greatest work. The magnitude of his work is comprised in this particular work. And if we look at it from that perspective, we've got to understand that this is not just merely a love poem, as many people interpret it to be. But yes, the story is based upon the marital love of a husband and a wife, and sometimes it can become very graphic, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean that this can't be a great and beautiful way of communicating some of the greatest thoughts that have come to mankind from God. So the wisest man of all, he writes this Song of Songs. It's written in the backdrop of a marital union of a king and his bride, but it is also carrying forward the great meaning of God. And that's what I'd like you to see next. is that this is a mystery of life told through the analogy of a love story. And so Solomon, who loved to examine the world, to observe the world, to write about the world, he looks at the world and he sees marital love as the highest expression of God's goodness to mankind. And we see this in the Garden of Eden, and Solomon would have been aware that it was not good that man should be alone. And so he brings forth a woman out of Adam's side to bring flesh upon flesh, a flesh and bone that is Adam's flesh and bone, and brings that unto Adam. And now here is woman brought out of man so that the two might be one. So this is a great mystery. And so Solomon tells the story, but he includes within the story more than just the story of marital love. He's telling the story of life. And let's kind of dig into that in some detail here. So the context is the great love of a king and a maiden. Now, it's a fascinating thing that he actually references himself in the song, that he's the great king, the king in Jerusalem. And yet he's marrying a young maiden, a shepherdess girl, one that might even be from Egypt, the way some of the language is given to us, that it's almost like he's taking a Gentile and bringing this Gentile into his kingdom. So let's kind of follow that line as well. This is obviously genre of poetry, the last of the poetry section, but this is a poem that is set to music, which makes it even more of a work. When you think of putting music to a poem, then you've got to get the right melody, you've got to get the right harmonies, you've got to get the right meter. So adding a poem to music is even more of a difficult task. And so Solomon is saying, this is the greatest work that I've accomplished. Now, I do want to go back to what I said to you when we were studying the book of Esther. And I said that the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. And I said at the time that there are many people that believe that Song of Solomon is the other book of the Bible that does not mention the name of God. And I said at the time I brought Esther to light that I did not believe that. I believe God is mentioned in the book of Song of Solomon, and I was going to show you, and so I'm going to do that, fulfill my promise to you now. It's found in Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 6. And actually, the name of God is found in context in conjunction with another word. So it's two words brought together when the name of God is in the word. And the word is vehement in the King James. Some translations talk about a flame, a mighty flame, but the flame of Jehovah is exactly the way it's phrased. And you'll actually find a number of translations that will translate it that way, that the love of God, or the love that is to really demonstrate the love of God in the world, is like a mighty flame. It's the flame of Jehovah. And so I think that is very powerful, that Solomon has actually coined a term here, and is using a term that includes the name of God in this concept of this burning that takes place in the heart of mankind and in the heart of God. So this vehement flame, or this mighty flame, it's the flame of Jehovah. All right, let's go on. I want to mention this because it is fascinating about the book Song of Solomon. And that is that like many poets in our world, they will take the language of that poem very seriously and choose words that are extremely meaningful for the text, and yet they're not very common words. So Look at what this author says. Lloyd Carr writes this about the Song of Solomon and the uniqueness of the language that Solomon uses here. Though this is a short book, only 117 verses, it has a large number of uncommon words. It contains 470 different Hebrew words, which is unusually high for this size of book. So think of it, 117 verses, and you're using 470 different Hebrew words to communicate those 117 verses. And this author is saying that is extremely high for this size of book. Only 8 chapters, you shouldn't use that many different Hebrew words. And of course, those words, 47 of them are unique to the book itself. That's the highest number of any book of the Bible. So for any book of the Bible to have only 47 verbs or words that are used, and nowhere else is that word used in the Bible. That's an amazing fact. 47 words in the Song of Solomon are not used anywhere else in the Bible. 51 of the words of the 470, they occur in other parts of the Old Testament 5 times or less. So they're not very common words. Those 51 are only found elsewhere, and they're used elsewhere only 5 times or less. 45 of those 470 words occur between only 6 and 10 times in all the rest of the Old Testament. And there are an additional 27 words that occur between 11 and 20 times. So not very many times. It's like the word Yahweh, for instance, is used over 3,000 times in the Old Testament. So you can imagine using a word over and over and over again. But here in this Song of Solomon, the words are so unique to the text. 47 words that are only found in the Song of Solomon. 50 words that are only used 5 or fewer times in other places in the Bible. So look at this last statement he makes here. He says, this leaves about 300 common words in the Song of Solomon. What compounds this problem is that there are only 18 verses out of the 117 verses, only 18 verses which include words that are familiar to Hebrew experts. So people that are reading in the Old Testament and using the same word over and over again as they read through the Old Testament, they come to the Song of Solomon, and lo and behold, there are only 18 verses in the whole of the text that have words that are common and be recognizable to any Hebrew scholar. So that makes the Song of Solomon rather difficult to interpret. Let's look at this next slide. So Lloyd Carr continues on. In other words, more than 1/3 of the words in the song occur so infrequently that there is little context from which accurate meanings can be deduced, and 2/3 of the verses in the song have uncommon words. Hence, many of the proposals made in the various translations and commentaries are at best educated guesses, particularly in the case of those which are unique to the song. They well may be incorrect in many of the translations. So that's an amazing insight into how the interpreters have struggled putting the Song of Solomon together in the language of the translations: English, German, French, Latin. Anytime the translation has been made, there has to be a struggle understanding the context of some of these very unique words. And that's why this Bible study group that I went with, we took them through every Hebrew word. So we looked at every word and saw the uniqueness of the word. And as the context is built around these words, you can see as it develops how difficult it is to translate. And that's why you can find multiple translations of the Song of Solomon that don't even know who is speaking at what time. Is it the bridegroom? Is it the bride? Is it the daughters of Jerusalem? Who's speaking at this point? Who's making this verse their spoken text? And so a lot of translations will have these completely backwards and from someone else, and sometimes we don't even know if the verbs are correct, if we're putting in the correct tense, and so it can be very, very frustrating. So that being held in mind as we go through the text, let's look at some of the insights that we can draw from this. So now these are my comments after 2 years of studying the Song of Solomon. And I believe with the Holy Spirit coming alongside, I was amazed as the Lord would begin to open to our hearts some of the meaning of the Song of Solomon. Now, I would not pretend in the slightest to have all the answers to the Song of Solomon. I would not even claim that. But as I have read many comments and many books on the Song of Solomon, I find there is a common analysis, a common theme that rides through most scholars as they write on the Song of Solomon. And it's not to say that they're incorrect, but I think that they've just scratched the surface. I don't think they've gone into a great depth of looking at the Song of Solomon in many of the ways that I believe Solomon wanted it to be said, to be seen. Now, that being said, what is the way that most commentators look at the Song of Solomon? They look at the Song of Solomon as a depiction of the great love of Christ Jesus for his church, or the great love of Father God for mankind. And I think that is appropriate. I think that's very well interpreted. I believe that's exactly one of the messages that Solomon was trying to communicate, that it is a story about the great God looking down on mankind, who in comparison to God is like a little shepherdess girl, maybe even a Gentile, one who does not look upon herself favorably. And here's the great love of God for this girl, and he wants to raise her up and bring her into his courts and into his life and make her his queen. So I think that storyline has been told and told and told. And I think it's valuable. I think there's great meaning there, but I think there's some other comments that we should draw as well. So let's look at a few things that I submit to you. I propose them to you and ask you to think on them and go to the Father and ask his wisdom as you do. So here are my comments concerning the Song of Solomon. I start with this viewpoint. We're dealing with the wisest man that has ever lived. And surely the wisest man that has ever lived is going to want to communicate something of great wisdom to us. Well, we saw it in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's really dealing with the great meaning of life. We look at it in the book of Proverbs. He's given wise sayings to kind of guide and direct our behavior. But aren't we also going to find that the wisest man of all is going to say something of profound wisdom to us in the Song of Solomon, especially when he says this is his greatest work? This is the Song of Songs. This one rises to the zenith, the apex of all of his thoughts. Surely something in the Song of Solomon is going to communicate to us the depth of the wisdom of Solomon. So that's my thinking. That's the premise that we're working from. Second thought is, let's look at 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 31 through 34. And then we'll go to Proverbs 25:2. So I want to read to you out of 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 31 through 34. And this is just a description of Solomon and his wisdom. So in verse 31, it says this: "For he was wiser than all the men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, than Heman, than Chechol, than Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was known in all nations round about. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spake of the trees, even from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He also spoke of beasts, of fowl, of creeping things, of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and all the kings of the earth which had heard of his wisdom." So here's Solomon, a description of him, and he was a scholar. He was an observer of nature. He looked at the cedar trees and he wanted to understand them, and he saw the great mystery that was in the cedar tree. He looked at the hyssop that grew out of the wall, this plant that was very, very small, and how did that seed get planted in the wall? He looked at beasts and animals of all sorts to understand them and write about them, because God had formed them with wisdom and with great intelligence. And so Solomon is seeking to find the mind of God in all of it. So here's the wisest man of all, looking at the creation that God has made. And now he's looking at the greatest creation that God has made, and that's mankind, and the mate that God has brought forth out of Adam's rib, the female, and the union of these two. He has looked upon this with wisdom and insight and wonder, and he's written about it in the Song of Solomon. Now, here's another proverb that Solomon wrote. In fact, it says in verse 1 of chapter 25, "These are the proverbs that the men of Hezekiah copied out," the Proverbs of Solomon. So the very next proverb, or the next verse, so King Hezekiah's men copied all these Proverbs of Solomon down, and here's the very first one that they copied out. "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing." I find this fascinating, that Solomon has written this about God in all of his wonder of God and all of his observation of the plan of God. He looks at God and he says, "God, you're hiding things. You're concealing things from me. This tree that I'm looking at, I have to really dig. I have to really examine. I have to study over time to gain any value of data that I might look upon this tree. I don't want to just gaze at it and superficially walk away and think, man, that was a big tree. I want to understand it, but it's hidden. The mystery is hidden, and it takes a great deal of time and effort to ferret it out." The last part of this verse, Proverbs 25:2, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, and it is the honor of kings to search out the matter." So here is Solomon understanding that God has concealed a great deal of his storyline, a great deal of his character, a great deal of his nature, a great deal of his power in this creation. And it's up to the kings to search it out. And God has given us the power, the wisdom to do so. And so here's a great understanding that Solomon is based at a foundational level on all of the Proverbs he's written. God has concealed something, and now it's up to the wise man to ferret it out. Well, here he's dealing with marriage, with the love of man and wife, the marriage union itself. It's a great mystery. Paul even tells us that. Here's a great mystery, and I speak concerning Christ and his church. So here's a great mystery, and Solomon is seeking it out. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, he writes about Solomon and Hiram, who was the king of Tyre up in Babylon. Solomon had hired Tyre to come down and be the architect and actual builder of the temple. And so Hiram and Solomon actually developed great fellowship and camaraderie and friendship. And Josephus writes about Solomon and Hiram and says they shared riddles one with the other, that this was a great pastime that they had. That Solomon would send a riddle up to Hiram and say, "Can you figure this one out, Hiram?" And then Hiram would examine it. He'd try to come up with an answer and finally send it back to Solomon. "I can't answer that, but here's one for you, Solomon." And he'd write him a riddle. Well, we do that here in our world. Our culture is not unfamiliar with riddles. We find that's a fascinating way to think, to actually engage the brain. So we've hidden a mystery inside some words. We put the words together just right, and now the riddle is, can you figure out what I'm thinking? So here's Solomon and Hiram doing this as pastime, as part of their fellowship one with the other. Don't you think Solomon is going to do the same thing with the Song of Solomon? That there's going to be a riddle inside the text. And he's challenging those that would have ears to hear, eyes to see, and the wherewithal to engage the passage. Don't you think there's a wisdom to be gleaned through those riddles? I do. I think that's one of the ways he wrote it. He wrote it in a riddle. So let's go on. Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon to share a riddle. I think this is a great way to understand the book. Even in the storyline of a husband and a wife, if that's all he's talking about, there's too much engaged in the storyline that has nothing to do with marriage. At one point, he calls, the bridegroom calls the bride a company of two armies. What does that mean? What does that have to do with marital love? That you're a company of two armies? Well, I think in and of itself, there's a struggle understanding what that's all about. We've got to take it out of the picture of marital love to bring it into some meaning. And so that's the story of Jehovah loving mankind. Okay, now there's a little bit more of a way that the bride can be referred to as a company of two armies. Then there's some sense that can be made here. So Solomon is hiding some of the mystery in a riddle. And I believe there are three great stories in the Song of Solomon. Three great stories shared through the analogy of a fourth story. The fourth story is the great love of a king and a handmaiden. But that's just the object lesson. That's just the analogy we're going to use now to draw from it the great meaning of the passage. So let's look at the first one. And again, these are my comments. This is the way I see it. Okay, the first storyline It's the story of Israel. Now, yes, we see that this kind of ties back to that story of God the Father loving mankind. And maybe we can center that story down on Israel, God choosing Israel to be his chosen people. So perhaps Solomon has used that as a way to define God's great love for mankind. He's defined it in the terms of the history of Israel. And I think there's some real merit there as we look at some of these great mysteries inside the language of the text. I believe if we look at the story of Israel from the Exodus to the building of the temple, Solomon was commissioned by King David. As King David was about to die, he pulls his son, Solomon, into the throne room. And he says, Solomon, I'm about to die. I'm going to crown you king. You're going to take the kingdom from this point forward. You have one job to do. Be strong. Don't defray. Don't turn aside. This is the job you were to accomplish. You give it all your heart. You build the temple of the Lord. Remember, David wanted to build the temple of the Lord. He had approached Nathan the prophet. I feel that I need to build God a house because he's living in a tent. He's living in the tabernacle. I'm living in a great palace. I'm not the great king. He's the great king. I need to build him a palace. And of course, Solomon was the son that Nathan said needs to build the house because David was a man of war. Solomon is a man of peace. Solomon's name means peace. And so Solomon was given this commission by King David. You are to build the temple of the Lord. I've purchased the ground, the place of the building. I've purchased much of the treasure that you'll use to build the house. The lot that is going into this house I have designed. I've hired Hiram to come and do the building with you. I've laid everything in store for you, but you have to build the house. So Solomon has got to realize he is the fulfillment of great purpose in God. He can look back over the history of Israel and see that he is the fulfillment of this great plan of God. The promises to Father Abraham are culminated in Solomon. He's wise enough to see that. He can look back and see everything proceeding up to his day, and now here he is in a kingdom of peace. There's no warfare. They have gained great peace over every enemy. There's no war in Solomon's day at all. That's fascinating. The land that God had promised Father Abraham is fully completed in its possession. All of the land is now inside the borders of the kingdom of Solomon. Solomon has to recognize he is the fulfillment of all these scriptures. When Moses leads the children of Israel out of the Egyptian bondage, he gets out on the shore of the wilderness. The waters collapse over the chariots of Pharaoh, and Solomon starts singing a song. When we did the book of Exodus, we read this passage, Exodus 15. And in that passage, it talks about God is going to build a place for his name, Jerusalem. Solomon's living in Jerusalem. And there was a house to be built for him, a place that he would place his name. Solomon is the fulfillment of that. Solomon's not dumb. He knows he's the fulfillment of all of Israel's history. And so he builds the temple. and God fills the temple on the day of dedication. Solomon writes the Song of Songs to encompass this great storyline of the children of Israel being redeemed out of Egypt and being brought into Israel. The temple is built. It's powerful. Let me show you a graph. Now, I've created this graph as a way to illustrate I'm trying to graph what I would refer to as the glory of the Old Testament. What is the greatest moment in the Old Testament's history? And let me move that out of the way just a little bit now. There we go. So if we take the Old Testament and say, what is the highest point of glory if we track it by time? So across the bottom of the graph, we have the time of the creation, about 4000 BC, and we see the different events of the Old Testament to the birth of Christ. And now we're going to plot across that timeline a graph of glory. And we're going to find that high on the list is the creation. Most people, when you ask them what's the most important event of the Old Testament, they're going to say that it's creation of the world. I'd say, yeah, it's a great moment, but that wasn't the greatest. God used that great day of creation to begin the process to bring about the great day. So immediately following the creation, you have this fall, the fall of man, precipitous fall, takes us down near the bottom. Then we start rising back up, these periods of reflection of the redemption that God wants to bring into the world, the flood of Noah, Abraham, man of faith. He comes into Egypt. Here, the children of Israel are in Egypt right here. So here we have Moses and the children of Israel in the land of Egypt, 400 years of bondage. And now comes this high point, the Exodus. Very, very powerful highlight of glory. But then the children of Israel walk in unbelief. They go into the wilderness wandering. They make their journey back to the promised land, and here they conquer the promised land under Joshua, and then they go through a period of the judges, another period of decline. But then at the conclusion of the period of the judges, you have the last judge, whose name is Samuel. He's also the first prophet, and he begins to anoint the kings. First Saul, then David, and then Solomon. And so here's Solomon building the temple of the Lord, and that is now the high point of glory in the Old Testament. And once we reach that point, God is finished with the great analogy. And so the children of Israel fall into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom splits off. You've got this fall into idolatry. You've got the children of Judah being taken into Babylon. There's a little bit of a rise again when they return from Babylon. But now there's this 400-year period of silence before the years of the New Testament. So this whole picture gives us an illustration of what God is doing in the storyline of the book of Song of Solomon. So I've put a little box around this period, and this period of time represents what Solomon is looking at as he opens up the Song of Songs. So let's look at this in more detail. So let's pull up that little section, and we'll look at this little box and see how that timeline unfolds. So you've got the conquest of Canaan, and then the dedication of the temple, the high point. 3 great mountains. It's about 490 years, so it's amazing that you've got 70 times 7 in this period of time. Those dates are actually given to us in the book of First Kings. So you've got 490 years from the deliverance of the children of Israel to the dedication of the temple. 70 times 7. God's trying to communicate something to us here. So there are 3 great mountains. It talks about Mount Sinai, the very first mountain that they go to. There's a second mountain. The promised land is actually referred to as that great mountain in Deuteronomy 3:25, that great mountain. And then ultimately Mount Moriah, Psalm 48, it's the city of the great king. The palace of the great king is the temple of Solomon. So 3 great mountains, high points along the journey. And these 3 great mountains are also referred to by Solomon in the Song of Solomon. He talks about the mountains of Bether in chapter 2, verse 17. In chapter 3, verse 6, he talks about the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. And in chapter 8, at the very conclusion of the book, he talks about the mountain of spices. So these 3 great mountains, Mount Sinai, the great mountain of Jerusalem, and then the specific mountain of Moriah. These 3 great mountains that are part of the conquest of the land of Israel and the history of Israel. Solomon uses words through the Song of Solomon that tie back to these great moments in Israelites' history. There's one passage in the Song of Solomon that talks about, here comes a great merchant out of the desert, out of the wilderness, with pillars of cloud and the myrrh and ointments and fragrances. And of course, it's a picture of the tabernacle coming out of the wilderness. All right, so the first storyline is the history of Israel. Solomon sees that storyline told in the pattern of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, going through periods of upheaval, through periods of doubt, periods of confusion, but ultimately they rise at the conclusion to these great moments of glory. So the Song of Solomon has those ups and downs in the storyline. At one point, the bride is rejoicing in the presence of the bridegroom, but then she turns around and she can't find him. And then she starts seeking him and then finds him again. And then there's this great reunion. And then she goes to another position where she is out of communion with him. Well, these are pictures that Solomon has placed in the storyline to illustrate what's gone on in the history of Israel. But the second story, and I have yet to find a commentary that deals with this, but I believe it's also Solomon's story about himself and his great journey to seek wisdom. There's an introduction to a maiden in the storyline of the Song of Solomon, and she's referred to as the Shulamite maiden. The Shulamite maiden. Now, there have been lots of scholars that have tried to find the town of Shulam in the confines of the kingdom of Solomon. Where is Shulam? So that we can identify the location where this maiden is from. Or is it from some place outside of Israel? But the problem is it's a Hebrew word. So where have the Hebrews been? Is there a town in Egypt named Shulam? No, there's not. In fact, there's no town anywhere that's named Shulam, that this is a Shulamite maiden. And there's no man named Shulam, where this is the daughter of Shulam. So what does Shulamite mean? It's fascinating if you look it up in the Hebrew. It actually is the feminine for Solomon. What? It's feminine for Solomon. I believe Solomon is painting a picture of himself as the bride. And the great king is wisdom. The great king is wisdom. And wisdom has come down and sought him out. He is nothing. He's a nobody. He doesn't have a high opinion of himself. He actually makes this statement: I don't know how to come in. I don't know how to go out. How did I end up king in Israel? I'm not worthy. And so he's seeking after wisdom, and God comes to him in a dream. What would you have? I need wisdom. So I believe here's a picture where Solomon is saying he is the Shulamite maiden, and he's seeking wisdom. And think about it from this perspective. The king is always presented in the Song of Solomon as extremely steady. There's no ups and downs with him. He is always on an even keel. He is always well together and perfect in comportment. But the bride is going up and down and up and down and up and down. And so Israel, in the storyline of their history, is going up and down and up and down. God is as steady as a rock, always the same. Wisdom is always the same. Solomon is going up and down and up and down. And it's a pretty good picture. And Solomon is just telling us his own story. Now, we saw in the book of Proverbs how wisdom was given a feminine perspective, and the man was trying to seek after wisdom. I believe he's done the opposite here in the Song of Solomon. He's made wisdom the male. He's made himself the female, because he is the one in great need. He doesn't have it all together. He's the one that needs to be redeemed. He's the one that needs a savior. He needs a king to come and redeem him and elevate him to the position that the king desires. So I believe that's the second story. It's the story of Solomon seeking after wisdom. And every now and again throughout the Song of Solomon, he'll throw a little storyline, a little word in there that's part of his own story. And so you can't see that word found in the storyline of Israel's history. Where did it come from? It's Solomon talking about himself at that point. So he sprinkled himself into the storyline. I think that's one explanation. And of course, the third storyline is the story of the Messiah and his bride. So I think that storyline is very valuable and very meaningful, but I would highly encourage you to consider those other two aspects of the storyline as well. I don't think we can find a perfect explanation for all the words that he uses in the text, with the third story just being the Messiah and his bride. I believe Solomon is telling his own story. I think he's also telling the story of the history of Israel, which are illustrations of the way God is calling us as the bride of Christ. So there's the great king, and the bride seeks out who he will exalt. All right, I've not given much time now. I want to take us to one passage of scripture and deal with it before we close. Oh, I did want to say, yes, let's go back to the story of Solomon, saying that Solomon is the Shulamite maiden. It is interesting. The very first verse, I mentioned I would come back to this. The very first verse of the Song of Solomon is the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Well, that's the way our English translation translates it. But it could be translated. And some translators have actually written this in because in the English we put a possessive apostrophe S on Solomon, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. But it could have been translated the Song of Songs, which is Solomon. So I think in the way it's phrased there, there's a double meaning there. So is Solomon saying, I'm telling you my story here, and wisdom is the great king, and I am nothing without wisdom, and I make errors when I don't walk in wisdom, but wisdom is always steady. But this is my story, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon. Interesting. Okay, let's look at this passage of scripture and then we'll close. It's found actually 3 times in the Song of Songs, and it's not the only time that we find 3 verses that are repetitious in the Song of Songs. And I think this is, again, picturing those 3 mountains, picturing the number 3 is very powerful biblically because it points to God. And so here 3 is a very, very powerful number throughout the Song of Solomon. So 3 times this verse is stated. At least part of the verse is stated 3 times. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awaken love until it please. Now, perhaps your translation that you're reading right now is going to identify some of these words in a little different way. I would challenge you to read it and consider it in the way that I've written it here. And you find many translations that'll actually translate it in these words. But I believe this is a more accurate translation than the way we typically see it written. The way we see it written many times, for those who don't have another translation, says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awaken my love until he please. And so here is placing these words in the mouth of the bride, and the one that is sleeping is the bridegroom, and so the love there is love of the that we would use in an expression of my love, or my favorite one, or darling. So it's a term of endearment rather than a phrase that defines love itself. And I think this is the way we should read it. I adjure you, I challenge you, I charge you, O you daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awaken love until it please. Now, here's I know I could spend an hour on this verse, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of an insight into what I believe is going on here. Obviously, the daughters of Jerusalem in this play, in this song that Solomon has written, we see them come and go in the storyline. They're used as contrasts. They're used as a sounding board. Every now and again, they're a chorus in the song. But you get the idea that they're matchmakers. They are selling love potions. They're trying to enhance marital love. And so here's this plea. And where does the plea come from? Whether it comes from a narrator, whether it comes from the bridegroom, I don't believe it's coming from the bride. But here's this narrative that just comes to these women of Jerusalem saying, I know you want to stir up love. I know you want to sell love potions and make merchandise and matchmake, but don't do it, because love has its own time. And that's why he keeps saying, by the roes and the hinds of the field. He's using these animals out in the pasture. They've come down from the high places. In the summertime, they come down and they begin to gather up some of the crops as part of their food, and they begin to eat of the field. And so here the deer, they come into the field, and the females become they go into heat. They become receptive for the male. And this is what is being referred to by Solomon. He's watched this, he's seen this. There's a time for this to take place. And when they come down, here they are. And all of a sudden they start feeding on the grain and the great crops that are growing in Israel. And lo and behold, it's at this time that the females come into heat. And now they go to the mountains, and they have the intercourse that's going to bring forth the next generation. There's going to be love expressed there. And this picture, Solomon has observed it, he's seen it, and he knows that this is the only time that this happens. And so the idea is that God has a time. There's a perfect time when all of his purposes are going to be fulfilled. The marriage supper of the Lamb is going to come at the conclusion of the great storyline of redemption. And so for us to try and stir up love, to try and make it happen before that time, it's really superficial. It really does not accomplish the great purposes of God. I've tried to do it in my own life. I've tried to love God. I've tried to love his people. And it really, I put myself under legalism. I've got to love. I've got to love. I've got to love. And it forces the issue, and it doesn't work. But when I allow myself to just rest in God and rest in his work in me, I see that he begins to bring forth love within me. And ultimately, that love will be culminated at the conclusion of the world, which is a picture of that temple of Solomon being completed, dedicated, and now here comes the holy God out of heaven and filling that temple in its entirety. So it's a beautiful picture to me that Solomon is using to show that there is a time and a place, and God is going to bring this about. We can't conjure it up. We can't work it up. It's something that God will bring by way of his nature coming to pass in our life. So I'd like you just to consider that for a little while and think on how the Song of Solomon has some mighty beautiful things to say to us if we can just read through the mystery and understand it. And maybe one of these days God will take us through the Song of Solomon as a lessons for the Sunday school class, and we'll just take a little time to go through it. I think you'd be amazed at what it has to say for us. But until then, I'll leave that with you. I ask God's blessings upon you, and I'll see you soon.